The metallic hum of air circulators was the first thing David Reyes noticed as consciousness returned to him. His eyelids fluttered open to reveal a sterile, white ceiling, the kind only found in medical facilities. A sharp pain pulsed from his right hip, and when he tried to move, restraints bit into his wrists and ankles. Subject Alpha 9H shows signs of waking, vital signs stabilizing. A cool, feminine voice announced from somewhere beyond his field of vision. David turned his head, wincing at the stiffness in his neck. The room was clinically pristine. White walls, gleaming metal equipment, holographic displays hovering with scrolling data he couldn't decipher from his position. A woman stood with her back to him, entering information into a floating console. "Where am I?" His voice came out raspy, throat dry as sandpaper. "Who are you?" The woman turned, and David's breath caught. She wasn't human, at least not entirely. Her skin was a pale blue-green, like the shallow waters of a tropical lagoon. Dark, pupilless eyes regarded him with scientific detachment. She wore a white laboratory coat over a form-fitting jumpsuit that accentuated her humanoid but distinctly alien physique. "I am Citra Thal, head of xenobiology at the Integration Complex." Her voice carried no emotion, merely stating facts. "You are in Research Station Valara, orbiting the planet of the same name." David yanked against his restraints. "What? Orbiting? That's impossible. I was on Earth, in my apartment." "You were selected and transported while in stasis." Citra approached, observing his reactions with the same clinical interest one might study bacteria in a petri dish. "The implant in your hip is already transmitting valuable baseline data." "Implant?" Panic surged through him. "You put something inside me? Without my consent?" Citra tilted her head slightly, as if the concept of consent was a curious novelty. "Your genetic and hormonal profiles made you an ideal candidate. The Intergalactic Science Council approved your acquisition 3 standard cycles ago." "Acquisition?" David's voice rose with incredulity and fear. "I'm a human being, not some specimen you can just take. Your designation here is Alpha 9H, she continued, unmoved by his distress. "The implant monitors hormonal fluctuations, neurological activity, and reproductive viability. Your physiological responses during various stimuli will provide essential data for our cross-species integration studies." David's heart pounded against his ribcage as the reality of his situation sank in. "You kidnapped me for some kind of sick experiment? To study me like a lab rat?" Citra's expression didn't change, but she pressed something on her wrist device. A hologram appeared, displaying a rotating model of a human male with various highlighted areas. David realized with horror that it was him, complete with intimate anatomical details. "Your reproductive physiology is particularly well developed, even by human standards," she stated matter-of-factly. "The testosterone to estrogen ratio, sperm motility, and pheromone production are all above the 95th percentile for your species. Your tool will provide excellent research data." The casual way she referred to his genitalia as a tool sent a chill down David's spine. "Listen to me," he said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "This is abduction, imprisonment. You can't just—" A sudden, searing pain radiated from the implant in his hip, cutting off his words and leaving him gasping. "The implant also functions as a compliance mechanism," Citra explained, as if discussing the weather. "Resistance triggers a mild neural stimulus. Nothing dangerous, but quite effective at behavioral modification." David's eyes watered from the lingering pain. "You can't do this," he whispered. "I already have." Citra turned to 2 assistants, who had entered silently, also Valari, with the same blue-green skin. "Prepare him for transfer to Chamber 17. The observation phase begins in 1 hour." As the assistants approached with a hovering gurney, David's panic exploded into desperate struggling. "No! I don't consent to this. Let me go! Citra observed his outburst with the same clinical detachment, then spoke in a dry tone that would haunt David's nightmares. Your consent is irrelevant. The protocol has already begun. The observation chamber was even worse than David had imagined. Unlike the sterile medical room, Chamber 17 was designed with an unsettling blend of clinical precision and intimate comfort. The centerpiece was a large bed covered in black satin sheets, with biometric sensors at each corner. Recessed lighting could shift through various colors and intensities, currently set to a cool blue that made the room feel like an aquarium. The temperature was precisely controlled, as was the air composition, slightly humid with trace elements David couldn't identify, but that made his skin tingle. Disrobe and lie on the bed, instructed one of the Volari assistants. David, now free of restraints but acutely aware of the implant in his hip, hesitated. And if I refuse? His answer came as another pulse of pain from the implant, this one briefer but sharper. He gritted his teeth. Compliance is encouraged, the assistant stated blandly. With trembling hands and burning humiliation, David removed the thin medical gown they had placed him in, painfully conscious of the observers behind what appeared to be a one-way mirror along one wall. Naked and vulnerable, he sat on the edge of the bed, trying to maintain whatever dignity he could. Behind the observation glass, Citra Thal studied the readings, already coming in from the chamber's sensors. Heart rate elevated, cortisol levels spiking, testosterone fluctuating in response to stress. All expected reactions for a captured specimen. Begin baseline sensory calibration, she ordered. Start with ambient temperature adjustment, then proceed to olfactory stimulation. Her assistant nodded. What parameters for the pheromone mixture? Standard Volari mating blend, combined with synthesized human aromatics, known to stimulate sexual response. Citra's eyes never left the data displays. We'll document how his tool metrics respond to cross-species stimuli. Inside the chamber, David flinched as the temperature rose by 2 degrees Celsius. Then a subtle change in the air, new scents that weren't unpleasant, but triggered unexpected responses in his body. Something floral, yet musky, with undertones he couldn't identify, but that made his pulse quicken against his will. Fascinating, Citra murmured as the biometric readings shifted. His autonomic system responds to Volari pheromones despite having no evolutionary exposure to them. The neural pathways for sexual arousal appear highly adaptable. David tried desperately to control his body's reactions, focusing his mind on escape, on anger, on anything but the increasingly potent cocktail of scents filling the chamber. But the more he resisted, the more his vitals betrayed him on Citra's monitors. You want a reaction? He called out, guessing correctly that they could hear him. Well, you won't get much more than this. I'm not your goddamn guinea pig. Citra activated the communication system. Your defiance is noted. Alpha 9H, but ultimately irrelevant. Every emotional state, including anger, provides valuable data. Your current cortisol to testosterone ratio is particularly interesting. I have a name, he snapped back. It's David. David Reyes. I'm a person, not a specimen. David, Citra repeated, testing the name without emotion. Your personhood is not in question, but it is secondary to the research objectives. As she spoke, she adjusted another setting, and the lighting in the chamber shifted from cool blue to a soft amber glow. The change was subtle but effective. The warmer light made the room feel more intimate, less clinical. David's heart rate increased again, his skin flushing slightly. What are you doing to me? Creating a controlled progression of stimuli, Citra answered. Your reactions are being carefully mapped and documented. The more you resist, the more pronounced the physiological markers become. It's quite efficient. For 3 hours, Citra methodically adjusted the chamber's environment, light, temperature, scent, even subtle vibrations through the bed that David could feel, but not quite identify. Each change was precisely calibrated to elicit specific responses, all recorded in exacting detail. Throughout it all, David alternated between rage, bargaining, and stubborn silence. But his body continued to respond to the stimuli, each reaction meticulously documented by Citra and her team. "The preliminary data exceeds expectations," Citra noted to her assistants. "His tool metrics show remarkable sensitivity to cross-species stimulation protocols." One of the assistants glanced at the time display. "The High Council expects an initial report within the next cycle. Shall we proceed to direct observational contact?" Citra considered this, studying the data streams. "Yes. Prepare Chamber 17A for intimate exposure analysis. The protocol requires more hands-on evaluation." As the assistants left to prepare the adjacent chamber, Citra remained at the observation window, watching David. For the briefest moment, something flickered across her features, curiosity that went beyond scientific interest. Perhaps. But it vanished as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by her usual clinical detachment. Inside the chamber, David sat with his back against the headboard, knees drawn up to his chest in a futile attempt to preserve some dignity. The past hours had been a psychological marathon, fighting his body's responses while trying to maintain his sense of self. But now, watching the Volari scientists conferring behind the glass, a new fear gripped him. What did they mean by hands-on evaluation? The door to Chamber 17 slid open, and Citra entered alone, in person, without the barrier of the observation glass between them. David was struck by how much more alien she appeared, the subtle luminescence of her blue-green skin, the too perfect symmetry of her features, the absolute stillness with which she held herself. "We're moving to the next phase of the study," she announced. "Follow me to Chamber 17A. David made no move to comply. "And if I refuse?" Citra's dark eyes regarded him impassively. "The implant can provide motivation, but I would prefer voluntary participation. It produces cleaner data." "So you're giving me a choice between walking on my own or being electrocuted until I do?" David laughed bitterly. "Some choice. Science often presents ethical complexities," she replied, as if this explained everything. "Chamber 17A, please." Seeing no viable alternative, David rose from the bed, acutely aware of his nakedness. Citra handed him a thin robe, small mercy, but he took it gratefully. They walked in silence down a curving corridor, lined with the same white panels and recessed lighting as the rest of the facility. Other Volari researchers passed them, sparing curious glances at the human, but otherwise paying them little attention. To them, David realized, he was just another specimen in an ongoing series of experiments. Chamber 17A was smaller than the previous room, but somehow more intimate. The lighting was already set to a soft crimson glow, and the air carried a different blend of scents, less clinical, more inviting. The centerpiece was still a bed, but this one appeared more like something from a luxury hotel than a laboratory. As they entered, Citra did something unexpected. She approached a control panel by the door and pressed her palm against it. The door slid shut with a definitive hiss, followed by the unmistakable sound of locks engaging. David turned, alarmed. "What are you doing?" "Ensuring privacy for the intimate exposure phase," Citra said, though something in her tone had shifted slightly. "This chamber is secured with my personal biometric signature. Only I can open it." A chill ran down David's spine as the implication became clear. She hadn't just closed the door, she had locked them both inside, preventing not only his escape, but also intrusion from others. "Privacy," David echoed, backing away until his legs hit the edge of the bed. "What exactly does this intimate exposure phase involve?" Citra approached a console along one wall and entered a series of commands. The room's ambient sounds shifted to a low, rhythmic pulse that matched a resting human heartbeat, 60 beats per minute. The effect was subtly hypnotic. The previous observations were valuable but limited, she explained, her voice more measured than before. Certain aspects of human reproductive physiology can only be properly studied through direct interaction. David's mouth went dry. You mean, I need to study your tool response mechanisms under conditions that more closely approximate actual mating scenarios. Citra stated this as if requesting him to fill out a questionnaire. The data will be most valuable if gathered firsthand. You're insane, David whispered. This isn't science, it's assault. Citra tilted her head. An interesting ethical interpretation. From a Volari perspective, we're simply documenting biological responses. Would you be willing to sit on the bed beside me? The casual nature of her request, after such an outrageous proposition, left David momentarily speechless. But as he struggled to form a response, he noticed something odd. Citra's hands, normally steady and precise, trembled slightly as she adjusted settings on her datapad. Was she nervous? Why did you lock the door? He asked, trying a different angle. If this is just standard procedure, why the privacy lock? A flicker of something, uncertainty, crossed her features before the clinical mask reasserted itself. The High Council has specific parameters for cross-species intimacy studies. I'm merely ensuring we adhere to protocol. She was lying. David wasn't sure how he knew, but something in her manner had changed since they entered this room. This wasn't just about the experiment anymore. You're going off script, he realized aloud. This isn't part of your approved research protocol at all, is it? Citra's dark eyes met his, and for the first time, he saw something genuine in them. Conflict, curiosity, perhaps even a trace of shame. Will you sit? She asked again, patting the space beside her on the bed. Her voice was softer now, less clinical. Against his better judgment, David found himself moving toward the bed. He told himself it was to gain her trust, to find a weakness he could exploit for escape. But a part of him was curious too, about her, about this situation, about what she really wanted. He sat, keeping as much distance between them as the bed allowed. The material was softer than it looked, conforming to his weight. Sensors, no doubt, recording every shift and adjustment of his body. I should be documenting, Citra murmured, almost to herself. She began entering notes on her datapad. Menstrual variations, not applicable. Valerian hormone comparisons required. But after a few entries, she stopped, set the pad aside, and simply looked at David. Really looked at him. Not as a specimen, but as something else. Her gaze was piercing, curious in a way that felt personal rather than scientific. You're angry, she observed. Wouldn't you be? David countered. Taken from your home, implanted with technology without consent, treated like a specimen instead of a person. Volari don't experience anger the way humans do, she replied. Our emotional spectrum is different, more controlled. Is that why you can do this? Because you don't feel empathy? The question seemed to strike a nerve. Citra's perfect posture faltered slightly. I feel, she said quietly, just differently. The research has always been paramount. Emotions are secondary. And yet here we are, David gestured to the locked door. With you going off protocol, locking us both in, wanting to study me personally. Seems pretty emotional to me. Citra moved slightly closer on the bed. The proximity sent an involuntary shiver through David, whether from fear or something else. He wasn't sure. Your species fascinates me, she admitted. Not just as scientific subjects, but as beings. The intensity of your responses, the unpredictability of your reactions. I've studied the data for years, but never, she hesitated, never experienced it directly. She reached out slowly, giving him time to pull away, and placed her hand lightly on his forearm. The touch was electric, her skin cooler than a human's, with a subtle texture like fine silk. David's pulse jumped, and he knew the room's sensors were recording every accelerated heartbeat, every spike in his respiration. "Is that what this is about?" he asked, his voice hoarser than he intended. "You want to experience a human firsthand? Turn off the recorders, satisfy your curiosity, and go back to your data." Citra's hand remained on his arm, her dark eyes unreadable. "I don't know," she confessed, and the honesty in her voice was startling. "I've never deviated from protocol before." The admission hung in the air between them. David was acutely aware of her touch, of the crimson light casting shadows across her alien features, of the subtle pulse of the simulated heartbeat filling the room. "What do you want from me, Citra?" he asked directly. She moved closer still, her hip now touching his on the bed. "I want to know what it feels like," she whispered, her voice losing its clinical edge entirely. "Not just the data, not just the numbers. I want to know how it feels when a Valari touches a human's tool." The word sounded different now, less clinical, more charged with meaning. Her hand moved from his arm to his thigh, the touch hesitant but purposeful. David's breath caught. Despite everything, the abduction, the experimentation, the violation of his autonomy, his body responded to her touch. He hated himself for it, but couldn't deny the reaction. "You're afraid," Citra observed, misreading his tension. "Of me?" "Not of you," David said, surprised to find it true. "Of this situation, of not having control, of being used and discarded." Her hand stilled on his thigh. "I wouldn't discard you," she said, and it sounded like a promise. When she leaned closer, David found himself not pulling away. Her scent, something alien yet strangely alluring, filled his senses. The clinical scientist was gone, replaced by a woman exploring uncharted territory with the same precision, but very different intent. As Citri's fingers traced higher along his thigh, the room's pressure alarm suddenly blared. A holographic display materialized above the bed, displaying text in an alien script that David couldn't read. But the urgent red coloring made the message clear. Something was wrong. A computerized voice spoke in the Valari language, then translated to English. "Protocol violation detected. Helix AI oversight activated." Citra's expression changed instantly. Fear, frustration, determination cycling across her features. She reached for the control panel beside the bed and entered a rapid sequence of commands. "Override," she stated firmly. "Authorization Thal Alpha 7. The alarms silenced, and the holographic warning flickered once before disappearing. The room's recording systems, David noticed, had shut down. The subtle hum of active sensors went silent. They were truly alone now, unmonitored. "What did you just do?" David asked. "I terminated the observation protocols," Citra replied, an edge of defiance in her voice. "No more data collection. No more reports to the High Council." "Won't you get in trouble?" A bitter smile crossed her face. "Undoubtedly, but I find myself tired of numbers. I want to feel you, not document you." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and honest in a way nothing else had been since David awoke in this facility. This wasn't about science anymore, if it ever truly had been. Citra's hand resumed its exploration, sliding beneath the thin fabric of his robe. David caught her wrist, not to stop her, but to establish something important. "If we do this," he said quietly, "it's not for your research. It's because we both choose it. I'm not your subject, not your specimen. I'm a person making a choice." She nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her dark eyes. "And I'm not just a scientist. I'm Citra." The simple statement of her name, stripped of titles and authority, felt like the most intimate thing she could have said. David released her wrist, then reached up to touch her face. Her skin was cool and smooth under his fingertips. Alien, but also undeniably alive. Responsive. She leaned into his touch, eyes closing briefly. When she reached for the belt of his robe, he didn't stop her, as the fabric parted, exposing him fully. Citra's breath caught. But before she could touch him again, the holographic display above the bed reactivated with an urgent flash. Institutional Order 419B, announced the computerized voice of the Helix AI. Transfer subject Alpha 9H to isolation immediately. Compliance mandatory. Citra froze, her expression shifting from desire to something closer to panic. They know, she whispered. They're ordering me to surrender you to quarantine. David sat up, clutching the robe closed. What happens in quarantine? Memory adjustment. Conditioning. Her voice was flat. You would forget this place. Forget me. Return to Earth with no knowledge of what happened here. That sounds better than being a lab rat, David pointed out. Though even as he said it, he realized he didn't entirely mean it. Something had changed between them in this room. Citra looked at him, conflict evident in her expression. If I comply, I preserve my position, my research, my entire life's work. She paused, seeming to weigh centuries of Volari scientific tradition against the connection forming between them. But I would lose this, whatever this is becoming. The AI's voice repeated its command, more insistent now. A countdown appeared on the holographic display. They had minutes before an override would be initiated. David took Citra's hand, placing it against his chest where she could feel his heartbeat. If you don't want to just study me, then tell me why you locked that door. Her dark eyes met his, vulnerable for the first time. Because I wanted to know you, she admitted. Not as data points or biological responses. Just you. The countdown continued ticking down. Soon, security protocols would activate. The door would unlock automatically, and personnel would arrive to separate them. Citra stood abruptly, moving to the control panel by the door. Her fingers hovered over the biometric scanner that would release the lock, but instead of placing her palm on it, she entered a complex sequence of commands. Transfer denied, the panel displayed, and the countdown froze. What are you doing? David asked, joining her by the door. Making a choice, she replied, determination hardening her features. If they want to separate us, they'll have to come and take us by force. The enormity of her decision wasn't lost on David. She was risking everything, her position, her research, perhaps even her freedom, for him, for them. You don't have to do this, he said softly. You could comply, preserve your work. My work, Citra interrupted, has always been about understanding. But I'm beginning to think I've been trying to understand the wrong things. She reached for his hand. Are you with me? David looked at the Volari woman, his former captor, his potential lover, now possibly his ally, and found his answer without hesitation. Yes. Together, they placed their hands on the biometric scanner. The door unlocked with a soft click. The corridor outside was bathed in pulsing red emergency lighting. Alarm systems flashed silently, warning of protocol violations. But remarkably, there were no guards, no security forces rushing to apprehend them. Only the empty hallway stretched before them, leading toward what the signage indicated was the main exit. The Helix AI is trying to lock down the facility, Citra explained, as they moved swiftly through the corridor. But it's prioritizing data preservation over human resource allocation. We have a small window before it redirects security. David followed her lead, acutely aware that he was fleeing through an alien research station in nothing but a thin robe. Where are we going? Transport bay, she replied tersely. If we can reach a shuttle before the security override completes, we can make it to the civilian settlement on Volara. They turned a corner, and a holographic projection of the Helix AI appeared before them, a swirling double helix that pulsed with light as it spoke. Dr. Thal, you are violating 17 protocols. Return subject Alpha 9H to quarantine immediately. Citra didn't slow her pace. Override function. Authorization Thal Alpha 7. Override rejected, the AI responded. Security en route. Surrender the subject. David looked at Citra, panic rising. What now? Instead of answering, she pulled him toward a maintenance access panel in the wall. Her fingers flew across the control pad, and the panel slid open to reveal a narrow service corridor. Maintenance tunnels, she explained. The AI has limited sensor coverage here. They squeezed into the cramped passage, the panel sliding shut behind them. The service corridor was dimly lit by emergency strips along the floor, barely enough to see by. The air was warmer, heavy with the scent of machinery and recycled oxygen. How did you know about this? David asked, as they navigated the narrow space. I've been here for 12 years, Citra replied. You learn the layout when you live somewhere that long? They continued in silence for several minutes, the only sounds their breathing and the distant hum of the station systems. Finally, Citra stopped at another access panel. The transport bay should be through here, she whispered. But there will be security protocols. I'll need to disable the retinal scanner to get us inside. She produced a small tool from her pocket and began working on the panel's security system. David watched her slender blue fingers manipulate the device with practiced precision. Why are you doing this? He asked quietly. Throwing away your career, risking everything? Citra's hands paused momentarily. Because for the first time, I'm making a choice based on what I feel, not what the data suggests I should do. She resumed her work. It's liberating. The security panel beeped softly, and the access door slid open to reveal the transport bay, a vast chamber housing several small shuttlecraft. The bay appeared deserted, the staff likely responding to the security alerts elsewhere in the facility. There, Citra pointed to a smaller shuttle near the exit. That one has clearance for planetary descent. They moved quickly across the open space, vulnerable and exposed after the concealment of the service corridor. David's heart pounded in his chest, expecting alarms to blare or security forces to appear at any moment. But they reached the shuttle without incident. Citra placed her palm on the entry scanner, and the shuttle's door slid open. Get in, she urged. I need to program the launch sequence. David hesitated at the shuttle entrance. What about the implant? He asked, touching his hip where the device was embedded. Won't they be able to track us? Once we're on Valara, I can remove it, Citra assured him. I designed it. I know how to neutralize the tracking function. A loud alarm suddenly blared throughout the transport bay. Security shutters began descending over the exit portal. Hurry! Citra called, already sliding into the pilot's seat. David jumped into the shuttle just as the bay's emergency protocols activated. The shuttle's systems came to life under Citra's commands, displays illuminating with Valari script that flowed like water across the screens. Unauthorized launch detected, announced the Helix AI's voice over the bay's communication system. Security lockdown initiated. Too late, Citra muttered as she completed the launch sequence. The shuttle rose from the bay floor, its engines humming with increasing power. The security shutters continued their slow descent, threatening to trap them inside. Citra pushed the propulsion to maximum, and the shuttle shot forward, barely clearing the narrowing gap before the shutters sealed completely. They were out, free of the research station, arcing away into the star-studded blackness of space. Through the viewport, David could see the massive structure of the Xenobiology Integration Complex, growing smaller behind them, its gleaming white surfaces reflecting the light of Valara's distant sun. We made it, he breathed, scarcely believing their escape. Not yet, Citra corrected, her focus on the navigation controls. They'll dispatch security vessels. We need to reach the civilian settlement before they can intercept us. The shuttle accelerated toward the blue-green orb of Valara, growing larger in the viewport as they approached. David watched in awe as the planet's details became clearer. Vast oceans of turquoise, land masses covered in vegetation unlike anything on Earth, swirling cloud patterns in its atmosphere. "It's beautiful," he murmured. Citra glanced up from the controls, a small smile touching her lips. "Yes, it is. My homeworld." The shuttle began to shudder as they entered Valara's atmosphere. Friction heating the hull to a dull, red glow, visible through the forward viewport. Citra's hands moved confidently over the controls, adjusting their descent angle, managing the thermal barriers. "There," she pointed as they broke through the cloud layer. "The settlement." Below them sprawled a city unlike any David had seen, structures that seemed to flow organically from the landscape, buildings that curved and spiraled rather than standing in rigid geometrical patterns. The architecture blended seamlessly with the surrounding environment, making it difficult to distinguish where the natural world ended and the city began. Citra guided the shuttle toward a smaller collection of buildings on the outskirts of the main settlement. "My sister has an apartment in the residential quarter," she explained. "She's off-world for another 3 cycles. We can stay there until we determine our next steps." The shuttle touched down on a landing pad nestled among what appeared to be vertical gardens. As the engines powered down, the enormity of what they'd done, what Citra had sacrificed, finally hit David fully. "Your career," he said softly. "Your research. Everything you've worked for. It's gone now, isn't it?" Citra's dark eyes met his, and he was surprised to see not regret, but a kind of peace in them. "Not gone," she corrected. "Transformed. Science without ethics is just technology. I think I'm finally beginning to understand what my research should really be about." She reached for his hand, her cool fingers intertwining with his warm ones. "Come. We need to get inside before security protocols identify the shuttle." They exited onto the landing pad, and David gasped at his first breath of Valaran air, richer somehow than Earth's atmosphere, with complex scents that hinted at alien flora. The gravity was slightly lighter than Earth's, giving each step a subtle buoyancy. Citra led him to a building that seemed to grow from the ground like a massive, stylized shell. The entrance recognized her biometric signature, sliding open to admit them. Inside was a space that balanced alien aesthetics with recognizable function: living areas, food preparation spaces, rest chambers. The lighting adjusted automatically to their presence. A soft, ambient glow that was easier on David's eyes than the harsh illumination of the research station. "We'll be safe here for now," Citra assured him, activating various security protocols on a central console. "The High Council won't risk a public incident by sending security forces into a civilian area. It would raise too many questions." David sank onto a seating platform that conformed to his body weight, suddenly exhausted by the intensity of the past hours. "What happens now?" he asked. Citra approached a food preparation unit, returning with 2 containers of a steaming beverage that smelled vaguely like cinnamon and citrus. She handed one to David. "Now," she said, sitting beside him, "we rest, and tomorrow we decide what our research will really be about." "Our research?" David questioned, sipping the beverage, which was surprisingly pleasant, warming him from the inside. "A voluntary integration study," Citra explained, a new enthusiasm lighting her features. "Based on mutual consent and equal participation. I still believe in the importance of understanding cross-species compatibility, but not through coercion or clinical detachment." David studied her, this alien woman who had been his captor and was now his, what, companion, ally, something more? "You really think your scientific community will accept research based on a sample size of 2? He asked. Citra's lips curved in a smile that transformed her face, making her look younger, less burdened by academic rigor. "Quality over quantity," she replied, "and we'll be gathering very thorough data." The implication in her tone sent a pleasant shiver through David. Despite everything, the abduction, the experimentation, the harrowing escape, he found himself drawn to her, fascinated by the evolution of her thinking, her willingness to risk everything for what she believed was right. "First," he said, setting aside the beverage, "I think we need to remove that implant. I'm not comfortable with any more data collection until I'm sure I'm not being monitored." Citra nodded, setting down her own drink. "Of course. I have the necessary tools here." She hesitated, then added softly, "I'm sorry for what was done to you. It was wrong. However, we justified it." The apology, simple but sincere, touched David unexpectedly. "Thank you," he said, and meant it. The implant removal was less painful than David had feared. Citra's medical knowledge and steady hands made the process quick and relatively comfortable. She sealed the small incision with a healing compound that knit his flesh together almost immediately, leaving only a faint mark where the device had been. "There," she said, placing the deactivated implant in a containment field. "You're free of external influence. Any choices you make now are entirely your own." The significance of the moment wasn't lost on either of them. David rubbed the spot where the implant had been, feeling strangely lighter without its invasive presence. "So," he said, meeting Citra's gaze, "about that voluntary research." 6 days later, David woke to the soft glow of Valara's sun, filtering through the apartment's adaptive membranes. The air was filled with the aroma of something similar to coffee, a local beverage Citra had introduced him to, that stimulated the senses without the jittery side effects of caffeine. He found her in the common area, already awake and working on a data pad. The past days had established a routine of sorts, mornings spent discussing their experiences, afternoons exploring the settlement, with Citra guiding him through the intricacies of Velaran culture, evenings dedicated to more personal research. "Early start?" he asked, accepting the cup she offered. "I'm finalizing the framework for our study," she replied, a new animation in her voice that had been absent in the research station. "Voluntary integration study, human Valari response patterns." David sat beside her, glancing at the data pad. Unlike the cold clinical report she'd been compiling before, this document emphasized consent, mutual benefit, and the emotional components of cross-species interaction. "What will the High Council think of this approach?" he asked. Citra's expression grew more serious. "They won't approve. It contradicts centuries of Valari scientific methodology." "But," she hesitated, then continued with determination, "it's the right approach, and I've stored copies on independent servers where they can't be erased." David understood the risk she was taking. "You're challenging your entire scientific establishment." "Someone has to," she replied simply. "Our methods have produced results, but at what cost? Treating sentient beings as mere test subjects has limited our understanding, not expanded it." She set aside the data pad and turned to face him fully. "Before you, I believed science stood above all else. Now I know that self-determination and emotional connection are equally valid evidence." David reached for her hand, marveling at how natural the gesture had become. This touch between two species from different worlds. "If they come for us," he said quietly, "we'll face them together." Citra nodded, her dark eyes reflecting a conviction that went beyond scientific inquiry. "We belong to each other now," she said softly. "Not as subject and researcher, but as equals." They moved to the apartment's balcony, looking out over the Valoran landscape, a vista of curving architecture blending with natural formations, all bathed in the golden light of morning. Below them, the civilian settlement was coming to life. Beings from various worlds going about their daily routines in peaceful coexistence. "I used to think understanding came from observation," Citra mused, leaning against the railing. "But now I see that true understanding requires participation, feeling, being." David stood beside her, their shoulders touching. Two beings from distant worlds finding connection despite everything that should have kept them apart. "What happens next?" he asked. Citra turned to him, the morning light catching the subtle iridescence of her skin. "We continue our research," she said with a smile that held both scientific curiosity and personal warmth. "But as partners, not as subject and observer." As they stood together on the balcony, looking out over the alien, yet somehow welcoming world of Valara, David felt something he hadn't expected to find when he'd awakened as a captive specimen. Hope, not just for himself, but for the possibility that even the most rigid systems could change when confronted with the undeniable evidence of connection. Whatever came next, whether the High Council's disapproval, the challenges of life on an alien world, or the continuing exploration of their unique bond, they would face it together. Not as Alpha 9H and Dr. Thal, but as David and Citra, two beings who had discovered that the most valuable data wasn't found in charts and readings, but in the unmeasurable dimensions of understanding that could only come through mutual choice. The scientific establishment of Valara might never fully accept their methods. Earth might remain an impossible distance away. But in finding each other, they had created something neither world could have anticipated, a study of integration that began not with captivity, but with freedom. And as the new day brightened around them, that seemed like data worth collecting.